They mocked it. Seward's folly, they called it. An absurd purchase of ice and nothingness. A frozen wasteland too wild to be useful. But buried under that tundra wasn't just snow. It was gold. It was copper. It was oil. It was a strategic prize so vast and so rich, it would power America's rise as a global superpower and haunt Russia's silence for generations. This is the story of the quietest land deal in U.S. history, and possibly the most profitable. Because what U.S. miners found in Alaska wasn't just wealth, it was a future, and it left Russia speechless. March 30th, 1867. The ink dried quietly on a treaty between two very different empires. Russia, desperate for funds after the Crimean War, had just sold a chunk of frozen wilderness to the United States, 586,412 square miles of snow, forests, and coastline for $7.2 million. That's about $150 million in today's money. The American public was bewildered. Congress grumbled. Newspapers roasted Secretary of State William H. Seward for blowing millions on what they called an icebox. One cartoon showed polar bears lounging under the U.S. flag. Another mocked a signpost in the middle of a blizzard that read, "Keep going, Seward's folly this way." But Seward wasn't foolish. He believed Alaska could one day be America's gateway to Asia, a trade route, a naval outpost, maybe even a future state. The Russians, for their part, were relieved. Supplying Alaska was a nightmare. Indigenous resistance, British encroachment, long supply lines. It was a logistical coffin. Selling it off, they figured, was better than losing it to a rival for nothing. No parades, no triumph. Just a quiet deal and a continent's worth of mystery sold sight unseen. For almost 2 decades, Alaska sat frozen in more ways than one. The U.S. barely touched it. There was no civilian government, no roadmap, no vision. A skeleton military crew governed the territory loosely. What few settlements remained were Russian Orthodox missions, indigenous villages, and fur trading posts. The land was remote, harsh, and expensive to explore. But nature doesn't care about your timelines. In 1880, that began to change. A local Tlingit chief named Coe led 2 American prospectors, Richard Harris and Joe Juneau, into the mountains of southeast Alaska. What they found would change everything. Gold. Not veins buried in rock, just flakes and nuggets, lying in streams, waiting. A small mining camp turned into the city of Juneau. That gold rush didn't just put Alaska on the map, it signaled that the land wasn't barren. It was rich. And suddenly, Washington was paying attention. Congress passed the first Organic Act in 1884, officially making Alaska a U.S. civil district. With that came a court system, a governor, and the infrastructure to attract serious settlers. It was no longer Seward's folly, it was becoming America's last frontier. Summer, 1899. A sleepy Alaskan beach lit by the midnight sun became the epicenter of a new American fever, Nome. Miners discovered gold, not buried deep in rock, but resting in beach sand. So rich, so shallow that some used frying pans to scoop it up. Within weeks, the coastline turned into a city of tents. More than 10,000 men poured in from Seattle, San Francisco, and beyond. They came with dreams, shovels, and greed. Nome exploded. Saloon tents popped up faster than claims could be filed. Lawlessness followed. Shootouts, land disputes, theft. But the beach kept giving. Incredibly, the sand was yielding up to $20 per ton, an astronomical figure for the time. People were literally digging fortunes out of the tide. And all of it was happening in a land Russia had once dismissed as a frozen liability. By the time Russian newspapers caught wind of the Nome gold rush, it was too late. Satirical cartoons mocked the Tsar for letting it slip away. Official silence masked internal frustration, because deep down, Russia knew. They had sold gold-laced beaches for pennies. Gold was the appetizer. The real feast was copper. Near the Kennecott Glacier, explorers found green streaks on the mountainside, high-grade copper ore shining in the sun, some of the richest ever discovered. In 1900, the Bonanza Mine was born. Backed by titans like J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheims, the Kennecott Copper Corporation grew into one of the most profitable mining companies in U.S. history. Over 4.6 million tons of copper were pulled from the mountain between 1911 and 1938, worth more than $200 million at the time. To move it, they built the Copper River and Northwestern Railway, a steel marvel slicing through glacier fields and unstable permafrost. It was back-breaking, ice-covered, and deadly, but it worked. And copper wasn't alone. Coal seams in the Matanuska Valley and Bering River region promised local energy for America's steamships, trains, and navy. Legal red tape slowed development, but the deposits were there. Then came whispers of oil. Geologists started poking around, and what they saw hinted at something massive, deeper, darker, and more valuable than anything yet discovered. 1968, Prudhoe Bay. A remote stretch of frozen coastline gave up its biggest secret: oil. And not just a little. Billions of barrels of it. It was the largest oil field ever found in North America. Suddenly, Alaska wasn't just a lucky investment, it was energy security. Construction began on one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in U.S. history, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. 800 miles of pipe running from the Arctic Ocean to the ice-free port of Valdez, through mountains, across earthquake zones, over permafrost. It finished in 1977. Oil flowed like blood through steel. Since then, over 17 billion barrels have been pumped through that line. Revenue from oil transformed Alaska. Schools, roads, airports, funded in part by resource royalties. And then came the Alaska Permanent Fund, a sovereign wealth fund that now holds over $70 billion. Each year, Alaskans get a check, not because they struck oil, but because their land did. But Alaska's greatest value might not have come from below the ground, but above it. In 1942, Japanese forces bombed Dutch Harbor and occupied two Aleutian islands, Attu and Kiska. Alaska became a battleground. The U.S. scrambled to fortify it. Bases were built. Radar stations erected. The Alaska Highway, a wartime miracle, linked the territory to the lower 48. And when World War II ended, the Cold War began. Suddenly, Alaska was America's closest point to the Soviet Union, just 55 miles across the Bering Strait. Air Force bases in Anchorage and Fairbanks stood on alert. The distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations across the Arctic, scanned for Soviet bombers. If World War III had started, Alaska would have been the front line. The Russians, who once couldn't wait to get rid of the place, now had nuclear missiles aimed at it. Let's break it down. $7.2 million in 1867. 30 million ounces of gold by the mid-1900s, worth over $60 billion today. $200 million in early copper. 17 billion barrels of oil, and counting. A sovereign wealth fund bigger than some nations' GDPs. And that's not even counting rare earth minerals, natural gas, or fisheries. What the U.S. bought was more than territory. It was a strategic gold mine. Russia didn't just lose land, they lost leverage. Today, the Arctic is heating up, literally and politically. Russia is rearming its northern frontier. It's building Arctic bases, laying claim to resource-rich seabeds, and running military drills above the circle. China calls itself a near-Arctic nation and is investing in polar routes and mining projects. And the U.S.? Reinvesting in Alaska, drilling platforms, Cold War radar stations reactivated, new military infrastructure. Nome is no longer a beach of gold, it's a frontline town again. The race is back on. This time, it's global. In 1867, Russia made a logical choice. They sold a liability for cash. They avoided conflict. But history has a way of punishing short-term thinking. Because what they gave up wasn't a frozen tundra. It was a treasure chest of resources, geography, and global influence. They didn't know what was under the snow, but the United States kept digging, and what they found changed everything. Russia never admitted regret. They didn't have to, because every gallon of oil, every radar ping, every dividend check is a quiet reminder that once upon a time, Russia owned Alaska. And then they let it go. What's your take? Dumb luck? Brilliant foresight? Or just history doing what it does best? Let us know in the comments. And if you love true stories with high stakes and global twists, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Until next time, stay curious.